Hi guys, welcome or welcome back to my channel and welcome to my first ever driver ratings. I've been doing race predictions and race reviews on my channel since the start of the season, so subscribe if you are interested in votes as well. But this is the first time I've done a driver ratings, purely because they do make me slightly nervous, because it is hard to fully take in what is happening in all of the drivers' races. Like, obviously, I know pretty well what happened to like Lando and Kimi this weekend, but when it comes to drivers like Valtteri Bottas or like Lance Stroll, like I'm not really sure what went on in those races, their races. So obviously, it's very easy for me to miss things or misinterpret things that happened in their races. So of course, let me know down in the comments if I've missed something. Can you believe their score deserves to be higher or even lower? But I'm going to do a score out of 10, and I'm just going to do full numbers because I feel like it's easier. Obviously, sometimes I'll say 7 for 2 different drivers and I'll think one driver did like a little bit better, but I'm just going to stick to whole numbers. I've decided to do it in the constructors order, so I've decided to start with Cadillac, so the bottom of the constructors table, and work up to Mercedes. So feel free to skip to any drivers which you're really curious about, or stick around for the whole video if you want to know all of my ratings. Hopefully in the future I'll be able to get you guys involved in this as well, and you can vote for your ratings and we can see how they line up. But that is something I hope to implement in the future. But as always, subscribe to be collected for the next race weekend, and let's get straight into it with Valtteri Bottas, who sprint qualified P20, finished the sprint in P19, qualified in P21 and did not finish the race. Now my score for Valtteri Bottas is just going to be a 5. And let's move straight on to Sergio Perez, because I feel like I can kind of talk to them about them at the same time. So Sergio Perez sprint qualified P21, finished a sprint in P21, qualified in P22 and finished a race in P15, but that was mainly because of the amount of DNFs we had this race. My score for Sergio is also 5, which may seem a bit unfair seeing as he finished above Valtteri, but he did finish last of the runners, really, and it was just bad luck for Valtteri that he DNF'd because of a mechanical issue, which Cadillac seem to be having a lot of at the moment. Obviously, it's not surprising for Cadillac to be at the back of the grid, but also it's very easy to kind of overlook their races because they're kind of just fighting amongst themselves. They don't have the pace to really be there up there with anyone, seen as Aston Martin has now taken a step up, so they don't really have a team to fight. So just like middle of the road. They haven't done like any real driver errors, but they haven't also done anything fantastic. So I think a 5 is just a safe score for both of them. Let's move swiftly on to Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso sprint qualified P21, finished the sprint in P18, qualified P18 and finished the race in P9, and my score is a 10. Now let me know in the comments if you think I'm glazing him, but that Aston Martin, although they have brought upgrades the last couple of races, they didn't look great, especially in qualifying. It kind of looked a bit like a downgrade this weekend, and yet Fernando still managed to put it in P9 and get 2 points at Aston Martin, which I think is so impressive. He's the only driver, obviously, who did a one-stop strategy. Obviously, all of the drivers, or at least most of the drivers, changed their tyres during the short red flag period we got after Max crashed out. But other than that, he only then did one stop on top of that. So that's what I mean by one-stop strategy, because that was only 2 laps in, so I'm not sure it really counts. So he went for a different strategy to everyone else, and he made it work to stay in P9, and I think that's super impressive with an Aston Martin which isn't really behaving half the time. So I think a 10 is a reasonable score for Fernando Alonso. Lance Stroll sprint qualified P19, finished the sprint in P17, qualified P19 and did not finish the race. Now I've just given Lance Stroll a middle of the road 5 because there's always issues in that Aston Martin. Like I said, it doesn't look like a fun car to drive. It looks like there were actually a couple of downgrades this weekend. There's just nothing really to note on Lance Stroll's race weekend. Obviously, he didn't do as well as Fernando, but with him having to DNF, he probably had a couple more issues, and you can't really expect him to do as well as Fernando. I don't think anyone expects that. So yeah, just kind of nothing really to note for Lance this weekend, and hopefully Aston Martin keep taking steps up and maybe we can see a bit more from him, but we'll see. Okay, moving on to Williams and Alex Albon, who sprint qualified P16, finished a sprint in P16, qualified P16, and did not finish the race. Now, I've given Alex a score of 6 because I believe he was performing better than Carlos the whole weekend, and he was actually about to do a very clean overtake on Carlos at the end of the race when Carlos locked up and took both of them out. Obviously, this caused Alex to DNF because he had damage. Carlos did manage to finish the race, but it hurt both of their races. Luckily, neither of them were in the points, so it wasn't like the end of the world, but still a very unfortunate accident and very unfortunate for Alex, who was driving very well this weekend. So moving on to Carlos. Carlos Sainz, sprint qualified P18, finished a sprint in P20, qualified P17 and finished the race in P16. I've given him a 4 out of 10 because he was outperformed by Alex the whole weekend even before the accident, and then obviously the accident was his fault. Obviously he didn't intentionally do it, but he was the one who locked up and went into Alex, which caused damage for both of them. It's still not a great car, so neither of them would have been able to do anything extraordinary this weekend, which was already shown because this accident was quite close to the end of the race and neither of them were near the points. But it is still a shame, and hopefully they get a better car in the future and we can start giving them higher scores. Okay, moving on to Audi with Gabriel Bortoleto, who sprint qualified P9, finished the sprint in P9, qualified P9 and finished the race in P13. Now I've given him a 9. I think this is a very, very strong weekend from Gabriel Bortoleto with the qualifying of P9 for both the sprint and the race, which is super impressive, getting into Q3 both times. Audi car really seemed to take a step up this weekend, and I think Gabriel got the most out of that in those qualifying sessions, and as well being able to hold on to that P9 for the sprint when arguably he had faster cars behind him, such as Liam Lawson in the Red Bull in P11. So it's impressive that he held on to that position. Obviously, unfortunately, because it was a sprint, that's not a point-paying position, but it's still very impressive. And I do believe he would have been able to get a point in the race, but unfortunately, he had that spin on lap 2, which was similar to Max Verstappen's, but obviously just a bit less dramatic, and he was able to save it. And that meant he lost positions and he just wasn't able to make it up. I'm sure it probably damaged his car a little bit or shook his confidence. So unfortunately, that did kind of ruin his race. But to get back up to P13 is still pretty impressive. And I think overall it was a very strong weekend from Gabriel, and he was outperforming Nico until the race. Okay. Nico Hülkenberg, sprint qualified P14, finished a sprint in P22, qualified P12 and finished the race in P8. My score for Nico is an 8, which is one step lower than Gabby because I believe Gabby was outperforming him in the qualifying sessions and in the sprint. And I guess we'll never know how Gabby would have done compared to Nico in the race if there wasn't that spin. But obviously Nico had a super impressive race with great overtakes in the midfield, which we actually got to see from the TV direction, which was really nice for once. But then they did cut away. We were watching Nico overtake, and then they cut away, unfortunately, at the same time where the VCARB cars got team orders to for Arvid to let Yuki through. So it would have been interesting to see that side, especially because there wasn't actually anything happening with the front runners, but I think it was nice to see the midfield for even a little bit. Hopefully it means the TV direction are learning and knowing that we actually want to see any battle that happens on track, because at the end of the day we are here for the racing, and even if that racing is in the midfield and even if it's not for the points, it's still racing and that's what we want to see. So hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. But Nico did really entertain us this race, great overtakes, and also at the start of the race when that clip was being played over and over again of him avoiding Gabriel's spin, which was super impressive. He had like a split second, I think he had a split second before the smoke literally clouded his vision, where he saw which way Gabriel's car was going. But to be fair, it looked like it was coming to the left, so he looked like he was going to go to the right. And to be able to avoid that and change to the left at the last second and avoid Gabriel by literally centimetres was so impressive. And I think he definitely deserves all the flowers he's getting for that currently, because that was super impressive. But yeah, that has added to his score. But the reason it is only an 8 is because his obviously his other performances like quali wasn't amazing compared to Gavi, but I am aware that he had issues with his car in the sprint, so it's not really fair to compare him to Gavi in the sprint, but I do think he just had a slightly weaker weekend. Moving on to Haas and Ollie Behrman, who sprint qualified P17, finished the sprint in P15, qualified P17, and did not finish the race. He DNF'd. So my score is a 5. I don't think there's much you can say about Ollie or his performance, because you didn't really get to see it this weekend. That Aussie Esteban Ocon outperformed Ollie this weekend, and I have factored that into their scores. But I also think that Haas does not look nice to drive. I think Ollie has always been recognised as a driver who extracts the most out of a car, especially even if it is a bad car, and he doesn't seem to be doing that at the moment. So that does make me think, wonder if there is any setup changes between the two drivers, or if he's just having a bit of a slump, because that Haas car seems to be consistently taking steps backwards, taking downgrades. I believe Ollie said that they are bringing upgrades to Monza, which is next race out. So hopefully we'll see them take a step forward, but it seems like Ollie's just not having a good time in the car lately. And obviously can't say anything about his racecraft because his car gave up like 5 minutes into the race. So yeah, definitely not a good car to be driving at the moment, and just not a very notable weekend from Ollie, and not much to say really. So let's move straight on to Esteban Ocon, who sprint qualified P15, finished the sprint in P14, qualified P15, and did not finish the race. He outperformed Ollie all weekend, especially in quali. He was very impressive in quali. Still doesn't look like a nice car to drive from Esteban's point of view either, but he is driving it and getting out better performance than Ollie is at the moment. But obviously his skills are still hampered by the car, but I have given him obviously an extra point for outperforming Ollie all weekend. But again, the car didn't... He ended up DNFing because of the car, so it is hard when the car is hampering their abilities. But moving on to Alpine and Franco Colapinto, who sprint qualified P13, finished a sprint in P12, qualified P14, and finished a race in P14. My score is a 7, because I think Franco did actually drive really well this weekend, but it doesn't really look like it compared to Pierre. But Franco did not have the updated version of the Alpine car, and Pierre did, so that answers for most of their performance differences. Alpine were asked whether they think that update is actually the difference between Franco's performance this weekend and Pierre's, and they said they think so. So they think it is purely that update, and that Franco was driving the best he could with the version of the car he had. So it'll be interesting to see how they perform against each other when they both have the updated version of that Alpine car next race weekend out in Monza. I think P14 was very impressive because obviously, like I said, doesn't have the updated Alpine. The other midfield cars seemed really fast this weekend. Obviously, I don't think Racing Bulls looked as fast as they have in previous weekends, but I would say Audi have definitely taken a step up. So those are other cars for Alpine to compete with. And Franco did have to complete a drive-through penalty at the start of a race because he overtook in the crash situation when Max went off under double yellows. Although looking back on it, it was very chaotic, obviously, with Gabby spinning as well. So you have Gabby spinning, you have Max crashing. Obviously, you're still trying to stay on the dry areas of the track and not spin out yourself because you know that those drivers have spun out because they've accidentally gone on the curb or gone on the wet area of the track. And I think a lot of the penalties that were given out were slightly unfair because it did just look like drivers taking evasive action, and sometimes they were going too fast under the double wave yellow, or I think in Arvid's case or someone else's case, they overtook under the double wave yellows, but I think a lot of it was taking evasive action and just trying to get through that crash site safely. So I do think that was a bit of an unfair penalty, but Franco Colapinto still drove very well this weekend despite it. Okay, moving on to Pierre Gasly, who sprint qualified P8, finished the sprint in P8, qualified P11, and finished the race in P10, and I have given him a score of 9. He did obviously have the updated Alpine, which helped him to outperform Franco, so I won't compare them with my scores, but obviously he got a point in the sprint and the race, which is obviously very impressive in the sprint because only the top 8 gets points, and he managed to hold off, I believe it was Gabriel Bortoleto, for that point, and that Audi looked very, very fast this weekend, so that was very impressive. There was, when we were watching the midfield in the race, obviously we did see quite a few overtakes on Pierre Gasly, but he did manage to regain those positions later on in the race, so I just think overall he had a really strong race. He was consistently fighting for positions and for points, and he managed to get a point and hold on to it. So I think it was a very impressive race weekend for Pierre Gasly, and I don't think it should be one that goes unnoted. Moving on to Racing Bulls next, and Arvid Lindblad, who sprint qualified P10, finished the sprint in P10, qualified P10, and finished the race in P12. My score for Arvid is an 8. I think this was a very, very strong race weekend for him, even though he didn't get any points. Obviously, again, unfortunate that sprint points only go up to P8 because getting a 10 in the sprint was impressive, seeing as other midfield cars have taken a step forward and seemed faster in the Racing Bull this weekend, like Alpine and Audi. I would say both of them looked faster than the Racing Bulls this weekend. He obviously out-qualified Liam in the Red Bull and managed to keep him behind in the sprint because they started next to each other on the grid. They had a bit of a fight in the opening lap of the sprint, and Arvid managed to keep him behind, which is quite impressive, but obviously Arvid has had all season with that car, and that was Liam's first race weekend with that car, so you can't fully compare them, but I think it was still impressive seeing them go wheel to wheel and Arvid winning out. He also got a drive-through penalty at the start of a race for overtaking under crash conditions and double yellows, but again I think it was more so just trying to survive the collision site and a bit of an unfair penalty, so he had a good drive to get him back up to P12, especially because that drive-through penalty dropped him straight back to the back of the grid. It was an impressive recovery drive even if he didn't get points like he usually aims for. Moving on to Yuki Tsunoda, who sprint qualified P12, finished the sprint in P12, qualified P12, and finished the race in P11. So quite a consistent weekend for Yuki Tsunoda, and also a very impressive one, stepping into that Racing Bulls, stepping into this new era of regulations. Obviously, he has done simulator work and everything like that, but also he didn't get much notice that he was going to be jumping in the Racing Bulls car. He's had no practice in a physical car in this new set of regulations up until FP1, and it was a sprint weekend, so he only had an hour to get used to the car this weekend before going into a competitive session, and I think he was super impressive. Especially the overtake on Gasly that we saw during the race. I think it was a very brave overtake for someone who hasn't been driving these cars at all. And he held on to it and he stuck with it, even though it went through multiple corners. And I think that just shows how amazing he is, that he can jump into a new era of cars and go racing straight away and get near to the points. And also qualifying, I think, is the most impressive part, because that's showing pace around one lap. So there's no error for mistakes in qualifying, and I don't think anybody expected him to qualify P12, and for him to do it twice and be consistent with that, I think it was very impressive. Obviously, it's a shame for him to miss out on a point, because there was a point in the race where he was running P10 or P9, I don't remember, but I don't think anyone will fault him for that, because it was an amazing drive and super, super impressive. And I think some people, some teams will have their eye on him for next season. I think it was like a little bit of an interview for Yuki Tsunoda, and he showed up, which was impressive. Okay, moving on to Red Bull and another driver that stepped in for this weekend, which was Liam Lawson, who sprint qualified P11, finished the sprint in P11, qualified P8, and finished the race in P7. My score for Liam Lawson is also a 10, because I think it's just so impressive for him to step into a team halfway through. Obviously, he does know how to drive this era of cars. It's not the same as Yuki stepping in, but I reckon, depending on how different that Racing Bull and that Red Bull car is, it might be quite confusing to step into a new team and a new car, and you still have to learn the differences, and you're so used to driving your car a certain way, and then you have to quickly adapt to this new team and this new car. And obviously, I think he had so much added pressure from his performance last season, when he got that Red Bull drive for the first two races of the season and then got dropped back to Racing Bulls. Obviously, that's quite a negative experience. A lot of people were talking about him and his performance and whether he would ever be able to bounce back from that last season. So to be put in that team again, teammates with Max Verstappen again, I think he dealt with the pressure very well. Obviously, he didn't qualify in the top 10 for sprint quali, but again, that's the first qualifying session he'd done in that car. It might have been very different than qualifying in a Racing Bull, so you can't expect him to get up to speed straight away. And obviously, he qualified in the top 10 for normal qualifying, which is the one that matters anyway, and managed to hold out for points. It is annoying that we didn't really get to compare him to Max in the race, because obviously Max didn't really even start the race. And he did get a 10-second time penalty for speeding 3 yellows, but he was far enough in front of whichever midfield car was behind him for that not to matter. So I just think it was a super impressive weekend, and I think he can leave and go back to Racing Bulls with his head held high, knowing that he's done a really good job and that people are saying really good things about him. Okay, moving on to the number 1 Red Bull driver, Max Verstappen, who sprint qualified P6, finished the sprint in P6, qualified P7, and did not finish the race. I've given him a score of 4, because I'm still quite impressed with the rest of his weekend, with the qualifying and his sprint result, because I think that car, the Red Bull car, was really bad this weekend. Definitely the 4th fastest car on the grid, and there's literally nothing else he really could have done. P6 was definitely the best result he would have gotten, or even a P7 with the 3 faster teams in front of him. Obviously, the thing that brings down his score is that his DNF was driver error. He did take too much curb in wet conditions. I know that Red Bull car is super hard to drive, especially seeing how much he has spun out over this season, especially in qualifying. It seems like the second he tries to push a car and test its limit, it just gives out on him. But I do think this was definitely a driver error, and yeah, he's definitely seen better days, better race weekends, and it's such a shame that this is how his last race weekend at Sandford went. But I'm sure he will bounce back next race weekend, and hopefully Red Bull can actually bring some updates at work and bring them a bit closer to the fight. Because right now, this race weekend, especially with Liam Lawson, he was very much in the middle ground of he's not fast enough to fight or challenge the top three teams, which were obviously Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren, but he wasn't slow enough to be in the midfield battle, so he was just kind of by himself. Obviously, like I said, still a very impressive drive from Liam Lawson, but again, we didn't really get to see him on track or his abilities that much because he wasn't really fighting anybody. He just kind of had a lone only race, and that's what Red Bull seems to be doing a lot lately. But obviously Max Verstappen always is able to outperform a car. Just unfortunately this time he pushed it a bit too far. Just an unfortunate race weekend. So moving on to McLaren and the winner of this race. Back-to-back wins for Lando Norris, who sprint qualified P2, finished the sprint in P3, qualified P1, and finished the race P1. I have given him a score of 9, and I was very, very much debating between a score of 9 or 10, so let me know what you would have given him down in the comments, because I feel a bit mean for giving him a 9. It is purely because of the sprint section of the weekend. I do think if he had... I think there was every possibility of him getting sprint pole as well if he had just put in a slightly better lap. But obviously it was only thousandths between him and George, and it didn't really matter. But also I think if he had gotten sprint pole, he might have been able to run away with it like George was able to run away with it. But at the same time, probably not, because that car looked horrible to drive in the sprint. I'm not sure what they did to change it between the sprint and the race, but whatever they did, it worked, and kudos to McLaren. But yes, it looked horrible to drive in the sprint. They just didn't have a pace. They were eating through their tyres, and that obviously allowed us to see literally one of the only overtakes we saw in the sprint, which was Charles Leclerc on Lando Norris. And it seemed like quite an easy overtake for Charles Leclerc, which obviously we weren't expecting after seeing Lando's pace in qualifying. Obviously he turned it around, got pole, and had a very dominant drive. Obviously Kimi did get in front of him during the second race restart, which I think was just amazing driving for Kimi, more so than bad driving from Lando. I think just both of them very hard but fair driving. And then Lando's pace, once he put on those tyres for his final stint, was blistering, and there was no way he wasn't going to win that race with the kind of pace he was putting down. And that overtake on Kimi for eventually the race lead after he also got past Lewis on the same lap was insane. Great overtake. Go watch it if you haven't. It is a very good overtake. He takes the opportunity when he sees it, and he sticks it out, and it's a very impressive overtake. And I think he's just driving with so much confidence this season, and to get back-to-back wins and to be the only other driver on the grid besides the Mercedes duo to have 2 wins this season, I think that says all you need to know. And I think maybe in the back of their mind, Mercedes need to worry. Obviously I'm not going to say Lando's a massive threat or anything, but I do think if he keeps putting down weekends like this, we might be able to get it to where he is a massive threat, and that would be very interesting to see. So the more I talk about it, the more I think I should have given him a 10, but just because of that overtake in the sprint race on him, and because maybe he could have got a sprint pole. But let me know in the comments if you're thinking that's way too harsh, because I am starting to think it is now. Okay, and then moving on to Oscar Piastri, who had a very different race weekend. He sprint qualified P4, finished the sprint in P5, qualified P4, and finished the race in P6. And I have given him a score of 6 because it wasn't a bad weekend from Oscar Piastri to say, but he was way off the pace from Lando. I don't think anyone can fight with that. He didn't seem, obviously, we know the McLaren car was bad in that sprint race, and both Lando and Oscar were showing that it was bad in the sprint race, but Lando really seemed to find the rhythm with that car in qualifying and in the real race, which obviously led to a win. Oscar didn't seem that bad in qualifying, but obviously not on Lando's pace. But qualifying seemed to be his strongest section of the weekend this weekend. So hopefully, if he keeps building on that, because obviously we know that track position is quite helpful in this season. So if you want anything to be good, qualifying is quite a good place to have most of your skill. And also, I don't want to score him too low because he had a horrible strategy placed on him, which maybe he should have fought against, but at the same time, like, you want to be able to trust your team. But I'm not really sure what McLaren were doing or thinking what was going to happen, because they pitted Oscar off of hard tyres, which he had barely been on. And like everyone expected Oscar to go for a really long stint because he was on hard tyres and to make like something work for him, but instead they seem to be trying to cover off George by taking Oscar off hard tyres, which firstly his pace wasn't very good on. Secondly, he hadn't gone long enough to make use of those tyres and make use of the strategy that those tyres gave him, and they put him onto another set of hards, which I think just ruined his race completely. There wasn't much he could do from there. Just a very bad strategy, and McLaren do seem to be in the era of if something's going right for one of their drivers, they somehow have to fuck up their other driver. So I'm not really sure what's going on at the moment in McLaren. Obviously, it's all going well on Lando's side of the garage, but I think something needs to change on Oscar's side of the garage. So a bit of a bad weekend for Oscar. I feel like it could have been a lot different with a couple of changes, but hopefully we'll get there. Hopefully, especially because Lando seems to be doing so well and McLaren seem to be bringing upgrades that actually work. So hopefully one of these days Oscar will benefit from it. But yeah, not a great race. Okay, moving on to the penultimate team, which is Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton, who sprint qualified P7, finished the sprint in P7, qualified P5, and finished the race in P4. I have given Hamilton a score of 7. I think what holds back his score is that he had a bad sprint quali and honestly not a good sprint either. He just didn't seem to be anywhere. I don't think anyone could really tell you kind of what Lewis's sprint looked like because he wasn't really challenging anyone. It didn't really pique anyone's interest. He was unable to overtake. Obviously, everyone was unable to overtake in the sprint. Other than Charles, but that's because Lando was really, really slow. So yeah, I just think an unnotable sprint, which I think brought down his score a bit because I think he did a lot better in the race. The normal quali was better, and he was showing good pace in the race, and I think he definitely could have been on for a podium. He definitely could have been fighting at least Kimi. I don't think he would have been anywhere near Lando anyway, but I think he could have been definitely in P3, maybe even fighting Kimi for P2. But obviously bad strategy from Ferrari. When Lewis came up on the back of Charles Leclerc, they were on very different strategies. Obviously, I would never, when someone is like, oh, I'm so much faster than my teammate, can you ask them to move out the way? I don't really agree with that because I'm like, well, if you're on the same strategy and you think you're faster than them, then just overtake them. But in this case, they were on very different strategies. Lewis did need to get through. Charles was like coming to the end of his first stint, and Lewis was starting his second stint, and he really did need to be let through for his strategy to work. But I wouldn't blame that on Charles at all, because they never once asked for Charles to let Lewis through. They just asked Charles to pit, which I'm sure Charles could infer slightly that they were asking him to pit because they wanted Lewis to go ahead. But at the same time, Charles isn't just going to pit when it doesn't aid his strategy. So I think Ferrari would have just benefited better by saying, Charles, listen, you're on two different strategies, let Lewis through. And then Charles could have pitted when he wanted, and neither of their strategies would have been messed up by the movement. But Ferrari seemed too scared to get Charles to let Lewis through, tried to play it off as a pit stop so they wouldn't have to ask him to let Lewis through. And obviously, that then held up Lewis for a couple laps. And it was only a couple laps, but sometimes that is the be-all and end-all of a good strategy. And then I'm not really sure how I feel about how long they then left Lewis out. But obviously, Lando did a pretty easy overtake on Lewis when he came up to the back of him. So just not a good strategy. And then also at the end, Lewis seemed like he was fighting for a podium again. And then Charles came up behind him and they started fighting, which then stopped Lewis from getting past George. So very, very interesting race from Ferrari, and especially costly on Lewis's side of the garage today. And I think if they do want to fight for this championship, which everyone is saying is a possibility, they don't even need to decide who they want to back. Obviously, Lewis is close in the championship. They don't need to always ask Charles to risk his race to help Lewis, but they do need to, when they're on two different strategies, they need to make more confident, more clear calls and tell their drivers, this is what's going on, you have to do this. Because that's not what we had, and I think it hurt both of the drivers' races, and I think we could have seen a much better result from Ferrari today, and unfortunately that's not what happened. Moving on to the other Ferrari driver, Charles Leclerc, who sprint qualified P3, finished the sprint in P2, qualified P6, and finished the race in P5. My score for Charles is P7. And it's the same as Lewis, purely because I think Charles had a very strong sprint side of the weekend. And also a good enough race, but obviously, like I just touched upon, it was quite bad with the strategy calls, but I wouldn't say that's on Charles, because he was just protecting his own race, and the team actually never asked him to get out of the way of Lewis, which they should have. But I would say, yes, he had a good sprint race, a good overtake on Lando, but in the real race, he had a bit of a bad strategy. He was a bit lacking in pace, and he had made quite an opportunistic move at the end of the race on Lewis, which obviously didn't result in an overtake, nearly resulted in Charles's front wing being taken off and potentially both of them being taken out of the race. Luckily, nothing bad happened, but I think maybe just a bit of frustration shown there at the end of the race, which was a shame. And again, I think something that could have been avoided by the Ferrari strategy and Ferrari pit wall, but are we surprised? I don't think we are. Okay, moving right on. Last team of the video, and the team that is currently leading the constructors by quite a few points, Mercedes. And I am going to start with Kimi Antonelli, who sprint qualified P5, finished the sprint in P4, qualified P3, and finished the race in P2. Now, I would say he gets a score of 7. So I would say his sprint quali was quite poor, and also I know he did qualify in P3 for the real race, but I would say he also did make a mistake on that lap. So both of his qualifying were a bit lacking when we are used to seeing him P1 or P2 for qualifying. So I would say he was held held up a bit by his qualifying positions. Obviously, his sprint seemed a bit lackluster compared to like the normal pace we see of him. He wasn't really anywhere. Obviously, he finished P4, which isn't what we usually see from him, but obviously, usually he qualifies higher, and he wasn't able to take advantage of Lando having really bad pace in the sprint like Charles was. I was expecting to see a Kimi overtake on Lando near the end of the sprint, and we didn't see that. So I think that was interesting, and I think did hurt his race weekend a little bit because every point matters. And then in the race, obviously he had a much better pace. He was faster than George in the race for sure, and obviously he had a very good race restart. It was very impressive for him to get in front of Lando, and he was able to hold that for quite a while, but after the pit stops, it was just so obvious that Lando was faster, and I don't think there was anything Kimi could have done. He did get a bit frustrated after Lando did overtake him on the team radio, but I think he was just upset because he didn't see Lando's move coming, because Lando's move was quite brave and a very good move, but I don't think Kimi saw it coming, so it was a bit of a surprise to him to then see Lando in front of him. I think he was a bit mad that he didn't defend better, but I don't think there was any way he could have won the race because Lando was just setting a blistering pace out there. And then obviously after he pitted again under the virtual safety car and put on soft tyres, he wasn't catching Lando at all. And honestly, I think he definitely would have got past George without the team orders, which is why I'm not really sure why the team orders were needed. Let's talk about the team orders, because firstly, Mercedes won't admit that they've chosen a number one driver, even though it is very clear that they have chosen number one driver. Also, I would like to preface this by saying nothing that Kimi did in the race was bad. Nothing is his fault, nothing is George's fault. Even Kimi said at the end of the race, I didn't really like that strategy call. I think it was too risky for both of us, and I think that's totally fair, and hopefully something they properly talked about in the driver debrief after the race, the team debrief. So nothing is on Kimi and nothing is on George for this team call. I think Mercedes either need to admit that Kimi is their number one driver or to not favour him as much as they do. Because I don't really get where they were coming from, because I think Kimi was faster than George and he would have been able to get by. And every other race before now, they've let them race, especially when it's George coming up to the back of Kimi. They've let them race. They've never once asked for George to be let through when George has been faster. And then they seemed surprised at the end of the race when George did end up on the podium, even though George had repeatedly asked them and said, I won't be able to defend. Please can Kimi help me and make this a double podium? George wasn't asking for P2. He was asking for some help, which literally could have been Kimi being let through and then staying within 1 second to give George overtake mode and to give him more to defend against both Lewis and Charles against, which Kimi didn't do because his team didn't tell him to do. Again, not Kimi's fault. Kimi pulled away, wasn't catching Lando, but he pulled away, and George was left to defend against Lewis and Charles, who were both on softer and newer tyres. I think Charles trying to make that move on Lewis really saved George. Otherwise, I think if Charles wasn't in that battle near the end, Lewis definitely would have got George and definitely would have got that podium. I just don't really understand the strategy call there. I think it would have been fine if they asked Kimi to be let free for then Kimi to help out George, because Kimi had better tyres, and if Kimi had kept George in the overtake mode and then George still wasn't able to defend against Lewis and Lewis came through, Kimi probably would have been able to then get up the road and save himself from Lewis. So there was no harm in having Kimi help George. So I don't really understand. I don't No part of me understands, but obviously that was neither of the drivers, doesn't affect either of the drivers' scores. That's just something I wanted to comment on because I see a lot of people talking about it, and I don't think anyone really understands where Mercedes were coming from, especially as a team who talked so much about papaya rules last season and how stupid they are and everything like that. And as a team also who has always picked number one driver, and obviously it's always been Lewis Hamilton except for the Mercedes era, which then ended up becoming one of the biggest rivalries ever because they didn't properly manage it. Obviously everyone talked bad about papaya rules last season, but Lando and Oscar are still friendly, still good friends, and they still help each other on track. But whenever Mercedes try to have two number one drivers, they seem to just create a rivalry between their drivers because they do unintentionally pick a number one driver. And then obviously their number two driver, who is still told that he's number one, doesn't get the vibe eventually. So I think they either need to admit that they're backing Kimi for the championship or they need to change something. They need to change something, otherwise it could very easily lose this championship. And this is what people were saying about papaya rules last season, that they can't be too nice, otherwise they'll lose the championship. I think it's the same thing in Mercedes. They have to change something, otherwise they will very likely lose the championship. Because it was Max Verstappen last season, and this season I do actually believe it's Lando Norris. If he keeps on this form, he could very easily come up to the back of them, and if they're still having inter-team battles, Lando could very easily take that championship away because he has the experience now of winning a championship, which is what the worry was with Max last season. Also, a lot of people talking about how if they were George Russell, they wouldn't have let Kimi through. I think George has been stepping on eggshells around Mercedes recently. With the amount Toto is clear that he waits till the last second to give George a contract, and that if Max was available, it probably would have been George that went. Like, everybody was quite aware. Everybody's quite aware that George is the least favourite child at Mercedes. We don't really know why, but that just seems to be how the apple has fallen at Mercedes. And I feel like George is just trying to keep his seat at this point, and he doesn't want to upset any of the dynamics even further. So yeah, it's easier to say than do, saying you wouldn't let Kimi through. But I think George seems a bit scared at the moment in Mercedes and wants to be seen as a team player to maybe keep his seat, which is a shame to see. Moving on to George Russell, who sprint qualified P1, finished the sprint in P1, qualified P2, and finished the race in P3. I've given him a score of 8 because I think I wouldn't necessarily say he was stronger than Kimi this weekend, but he has been stronger than he has been for the majority of the season, to be honest. He looked very good in the sprint, qualifying P1 and finishing P1. He just pulled away. Obviously, at the start, we were like, oh, maybe Lando's going to have a chance to catch him, but we found out he was actually just making sure his tyres stayed in good shape, and then he pulled away and he won that sprint fair and square, and it looked like a very dominant drive. And then obviously qualifying P2, I think the one thing George may need to focus on is his starts, because he does seem to fall back quite a lot. When he's on pole, he seems fine with his starts, but when he's anywhere further down the pole, he does seem to lose a couple of positions, which is a shame. And I think he was just off the pace a bit, and I think he was also on a different strategy, so you would look halfway during the race and you weren't really sure where he would end up. I don't think anyone actually expected him to end up on the podium, because I think everyone expected Lewis to end up on the podium, and I think with a different strategy call from Ferrari, Lewis definitely could have ended up on the podium. So I think it was a bit lucky for George today, but also I do think he drove well, and that defence at the end was super good because there was no way he should have been able to defend against two Ferraris, both on very new soft tyres. So that was very impressive. Obviously, I've already mentioned the controversy. It's just a shame for George, and hopefully, it's hard to win a title without your team backing you, but let's hope that George doesn't give up just yet. So, those were all my driver ratings for the Dutch Grand Prix. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know in the comments if you disagreed with me on anything, or even if you agreed with me on anything. That would be nice. Obviously, subscribe and stick around for other Formula One related videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.